When did you refuse to back down? My 4-year-old foster daughter Amelia came back from her weekend adoption prep at Miss Lee's group home sitting perfectly still. When I touched her shoulder, she whispered, "The empty princesses get chosen for special families. I have to practice being nothing." Her legs had bruises from sitting in the same position for hours. I called Lee demanding answers. "You're being paranoid," she said sweetly. "I'm documenting this call. The judge will love hearing how you're sabotaging Amelia's chance at adoption." But 2 days later, I got my proof. Because that's when Isabella's foster mom called. Isabella was one of 12 girls in Lee's preparation program, all ages 3 to 7, and she came to her foster home with the same pressure sores. Her mom mentioned Isabella kept saying, "Amelia taught me to go empty," but wouldn't explain what that meant. That's when I realized this wasn't isolated to my daughter. I called every foster parent whose child went to Lee's program. 5 other girls were practicing being dolls in the past 2 months. One mom said her daughter kept a chart tracking who was perfect enough for selection. Another found her 4-year-old practicing not blinking at 2 a.m., whispering, "Perfect princesses don't need to see." 5 days until Amelia's next prep weekend. Lee's assistant sent me a text. "Stop interfering with your daughter's progression. She's not broken in enough for our type of audience. You must let her thrive." The words "broken in" made my blood run cold. I went to CPS with videos of the girls in their doll-like states and statements from 6 foster parents. The caseworker said children play pretend all the time, and without evidence of physical abuse, they couldn't investigate. She actually wrote in her notes that I appeared to be interfering with adoption protocols. 2 days wasted. One mother, Lauren, was my last hope. Her daughter, Ellie, used to be the type of girl to race rabbits and pet ducks. But she got selected by a special family 2 months ago. The adoption fell through after 1 week, and when she came back, she was gone. She slept in her closet, wouldn't speak above a whisper, even drew pictures of girls with X's over their mouths. Her mother just told me she couldn't help. I had 3 days left and tried the police again. The officer actually laughed. "Little girls playing princess isn't a crime, ma'am. Maybe focus on being grateful that someone wants to adopt them?" He slid the videos back without watching. Besides, Miss Lee already called. Said you might come in with wild stories. That night, Amelia stood at the mirror practicing her empty stare. "I'm getting too good at feeling things again," she said matter-of-factly. "I'll get selected next time." My phone buzzed. It was my lawyer. I begged him to file anything that would let me keep her from prep weekend. He stayed silent until I finished pleading to say the words that broke me. If I didn't send Amelia for her sessions, I'd lose all foster privileges permanently. I had 24 hours to decide between keeping her safe or keeping her at all. Amelia gave me a folded paper at breakfast. Ellie drew this before she got chosen. It showed a room full of men pointing at girls on a stage. The guilt in her 4-year-old voice trying to warn me broke me. 1 hour left and Amelia gripped my hand in the car. What if I can't go empty enough this time? When we pulled into Lee's driveway, 2 other cars were already there. Julia climbed out first, 5 years old, practicing her doll walk. Then Grace, 7, with perfect posture already. Amelia saw them and started crying. "Not them! They're almost ready!" I just smiled. Because I wasn't just dropping Amelia off tonight. I was getting into that showcase room. I called my cousin Randy, ex-military interrogator, and told him what was happening. "Give me 30, was all he said. The other foster parents were walking their daughters to the door. Randy arrived with his partner Finch. They'd done 3 tours together. Lee came out smiling, clipboard ready. But her face changed when she saw Randy. "Get inside," Randy said quietly. The other parents held their daughters back as we followed her in. Her assistant tried to run. Finch caught her in the hallway and had her zip-tied to a chair in seconds. Lee backed against the wall. "This is kidnapping. You just lost custody forever. Where's the showcase room?" I cut her off. Randy already found it. Electronic lock, just like the former employee said. He had it bypassed in under a minute. Lee went white. "You can't go in there. Please. You don't understand who—" I moved toward the door. The door opened into darkness and I fumbled for a light switch while Randy pushed past me with his phone flashlight already on. The overhead lights clicked on and my stomach twisted at what I saw. Small platforms lined up in perfect rows, each one numbered from 1 to 12. Spotlights hung directly above each platform, angled down to create perfect circles of light. At the far end of the room sat a viewing area with leather chairs arranged in a semicircle. Randy was already recording everything on his phone while behind us Finch kept Lee pinned against the hallway wall. The assistant struggled against her zip ties but couldn't break free. I stepped closer to the platforms, and that's when the smell hit me. Cleaning products mixed with something else. Something that made my skin crawl. Fear had a smell and this room reeked of it. My hands shook as I pulled out my phone and started taking pictures. The platforms were child height, maybe 2 feet off the ground. On platform number 3, I saw scratch marks where tiny fingernails had dug into the wood. Behind the viewing chairs stretched a long mirror that ran the entire length of the wall. I walked closer and realized it was one-way glass. People could watch from behind without being seen. In the corner sat a white box and I lifted the lid with trembling fingers. White dresses filled it, all different sizes but the same style. The smallest ones looked made for toddlers. Randy had found a filing cabinet against the side wall and yanked it open. Folders spilled out and he grabbed them while Lee started screaming from the hallway. "You're going to prison for this. This is breaking and entering. I'll sue you for everything." Randy ignored her and spread the folders across one of the platforms. Each folder had a photo paper-clipped to the front. Young girls, all between 3 and 7 years old. I recognized Julia's face immediately, then Grace, then Isabella. Randy opened Julia's folder and I read over his shoulder. The evaluation form had categories that made me sick. Compliance rated on a scale of 1 to 10. Presentation scored the same way. Something called malleability with notes about resistance levels and conditioning progress. My hands fumbled through the folders until I found Amelia's. Her photo showed her smiling, taken before all this started. The evaluation notes made me grab the nearest trash can. Exceptional potential for complete psychological restructuring was written in neat handwriting. Shows initial resistance but responds well to isolation and reward removal. The dates for future showcases were circled in red. Friday's date had a star next to it with pre-selected for premium viewing written beside it. Premium viewing. Those 2 words made everything clear. Finch called out from across the room where he'd found something mounted on the wall. A camera system with multiple angles covering every inch of the room. Red lights blinked on each camera showing they were recording. He traced the cables to a locked metal box and pried it open with a screwdriver from his pocket. Inside sat a hard drive, multiple USB ports, and what looked like streaming equipment. Lee went completely silent when she saw him disconnect the hard drive. Her face turned white and she stopped struggling against the wall. The assistant started crying and begging Finch to let her go. Outside, I heard car doors slamming and remembered tonight was a regular session. More foster parents were bringing their daughters right now. Randy looked up from the files and pointed toward the door. "Go stop them. We'll keep these 2 here and secure everything." I ran through the hallway and burst out the front door just as 3 more cars pulled up. The first car's door opened and a woman helped her daughter out. The little girl walked like a robot, each step measured and perfect. Another car door opened and out came a 6-year-old practicing her empty stare. I ran toward them waving my arms. "Stop! Don't go inside." The parents looked confused and one started to argue, but I pulled out my phone. The photos of the showcase room made them gasp. One mother saw the platforms and started shaking. "My daughter has nightmares about standing on number 7. She wakes up crying about her number." The other parents gathered around as I showed them more pictures. The white dresses, the viewing chairs, the one-way mirror. A father grabbed his daughter and held her tight. We formed a circle in the driveway, all of us keeping our girls close. I dialed 911 and this time asked specifically for a supervisor. "We have evidence of child trafficking at Miss Lee's facility. We have video evidence and multiple witnesses." The dispatcher's tone changed immediately when I mentioned trafficking and evidence. She said units were on the way and to keep everyone outside for their safety. My next call was to Elena Reiner, a pediatrician who specialized in documenting child abuse cases. She answered on the second ring and I explained everything in rushed sentences. She said she'd leave immediately and bring her forensic photography equipment. 10 minutes later, the first police car pulled up and my heart sank. It was the same officer who had laughed at me before. He got out of his car already looking annoyed. "Ma'am, I told you already that Miss Lee runs a legitimate program." But Randy appeared in the doorway and called out to him. "Officer, you need to see this room." The officer followed Randy inside and I watched through the doorway as his whole expression changed. His hand went to his radio and he called for backup and a detective unit immediately. Randy pulled the officer over to the filing cabinet and started laying out folder after folder on a nearby desk. The officer's face went from annoyed to shocked as he saw the photos of little girls paper-clipped to evaluation forms with ratings for compliance and presentation. I knelt down next to Amelia, who kept tugging on my shirt asking if she did something wrong. The other girls had moved together near the wall and I watched them automatically arrange themselves in a line by their numbers. Julia stood at position 5, Grace at 7. Even without being told, they knew their places. More sirens filled the driveway and I heard car doors slamming outside. Randy kept showing the officer more files while pointing at specific notes about psychological restructuring and malleability scores. The officer grabbed his radio again and I heard him request a forensics team immediately. Dr. Reiner rushed through the door with a large medical bag and went straight to the girls. She spoke softly to each one while examining their legs and arms. I watched her document pressure sores on Julia's knees and bruises along Grace's spine from holding positions too long. She photographed each injury with a small camera and made notes on a tablet. Amelia wouldn't let go of my hand as Reiner checked her over. The doctor found marks on her ankles from sitting cross-legged for hours and what looked like fingernail marks on her arms where she'd been gripping herself. A black town car pulled up outside and a man in an expensive suit got out carrying a briefcase. Lee's lawyer walked in already talking about false imprisonment and threatening to sue everyone present. Randy just pointed him toward the showcase room. The lawyer went silent when he saw the platforms and viewing chairs. His whole attitude changed, and he pulled Lee aside, whispering urgently. More police arrived, including a woman detective who specialized in crimes against children. She took one look at the room and immediately started taking photos of everything. She found a scheduling book we'd missed tucked behind the mirror with initials next to dates and what looked like payment codes. The detective called for additional units to secure the entire property as a crime scene. I pulled out my phone and started texting every foster parent whose child was in Lee's program. I told them not to bring their daughters here ever again and asked them to check for bruises or pressure sores. My phone started buzzing immediately with responses. Photos of bruises on legs, marks on backs. One mom sent a video of her daughter practicing her doll pose at 3 a.m. The detective started interviewing parents one by one in the hallway, while Reiner continued examining each girl. She pulled me aside after checking the 7th child and told me quietly that several girls showed signs of systematic conditioning that bordered on torture. The sleep deprivation alone could cause lasting damage. Cullen Budd arrived with a photographer but immediately agreed to keep all the children's faces out of any photos. He started documenting the showcase room and interviewing parents who were willing to talk. I watched him take notes as one mother described finding her daughter standing perfectly still in their backyard for 2 hours. Another expensive car pulled up and Donovan English from CPS got out looking annoyed. He started complaining about being called out after hours until the detective led him to the showcase room. His face went white when he saw the platforms, and Reiner's preliminary medical report spread on a table. He immediately got on his phone ordering a full investigation of Lee's facility and every placement she'd handled. He found me in the crowd of parents and apologized for his department dismissing my concerns. Lee tried to speak up, saying this was all a misunderstanding. She claimed she was just teaching the girls proper behavior for meeting adoptive families. The detective showed her the hidden cameras and payment codes from the scheduling book. Lee stopped talking and looked at her lawyer, who told her not to say another word. The assistant started crying harder in her chair. Finch had been watching her the whole time, and now the detective turned her attention there. The assistant broke down completely and started talking about how Lee told her the girls needed to be prepared for selection. She said Lee had a list of special clients who liked their children completely obedient. She mentioned names of people who'd attended previous showcases. The detective's expression got darker with each name. She called for backup to start locating these individuals immediately. Parents kept arriving after getting my texts and the driveway filled with cars. Each one wanted to see the showcase room for themselves. The detective had to post an officer at the door to preserve the crime scene. Reiner set up a makeshift examination area in another room, and parents brought their daughters in one by one. The evidence kept mounting. Bruises, pressure sores, signs of sleep deprivation, and psychological trauma in every single girl who'd been through Lee's program. English's team started arriving to document everything and begin emergency custody reviews. The showcase room had been set up for tomorrow night's viewing, and they found a list of expected attendees tucked into Lee's desk drawer. The detective immediately recognized several prominent names and made more calls. Within an hour, the entire property was surrounded by police vehicles and crime scene tape. The detective started checking other rooms while Randy kept poking around the main office area. Behind a bookshelf in Lee's office, we found another door with a keypad lock that nobody had noticed before. The detective called his tech guy, who showed up with tools and had it open in about 20 minutes. Inside was worse than the showcase room. 3 computers were still running with external hard drives attached and stacks of DVDs labeled with dates going back 5 years. The detective put on gloves and started checking the computer screens while making sure nothing got deleted. One screen showed a video editing program with clips of girls practicing their poses. Another had spreadsheets with names and numbers that made my stomach turn. The detective immediately called for the computer forensics team and told everyone not to touch anything else in that room. English pulled out his phone and started making calls right there in the hallway. He was ordering emergency protective custody for all 12 girls in the program and wanted social workers at each house tonight. I heard him tell someone on the phone to check on every single girl and document any signs of abuse or conditioning. Amelia had been clinging to me this whole time, but suddenly she just broke down sobbing. She kept saying she tried so hard to be empty, but it made her feel like she was disappearing inside. Her little body was shaking and she couldn't catch her breath. Reiner came over and helped me calm her down, then pulled me aside to give me cards for trauma specialists who could start seeing Amelia immediately. She said the conditioning these girls went through would need intensive therapy to undo. The detective found a filing cabinet in that locked room with financial records showing deposits of $10,000, $20,000, even $50,000 after certain dates. Some deposits were reversed a week or 2 later when girls got returned. The amounts were way too high for normal adoption fees. He took photos of everything and said this proved human trafficking, not just illegal adoption. Randy was still searching Lee's main office when he noticed a picture frame sitting crooked on the wall. He pulled it away and found a wall safe with a digital lock. The detective added it to the evidence list and said they'd need a warrant to get it opened properly by professionals who could preserve any evidence inside. Parents started talking to each other in the hallway about weird things their daughters did after Lee's sessions. One mom said her daughter would wake up at 3 a.m. to practice statue games in the bathroom. Another found her 4-year-old hiding in the closet, whispering that she needed to practice being small and quiet. Every story made the pattern clearer. A car pulled up outside and a woman in a suit got out carrying a briefcase. English told me it was ADA Samara Gentry, who handled major crimes against children. She walked straight to the showcase room and stood there taking it all in. Then she looked at the platforms, the viewing area, and the hidden cameras. She pulled out her phone and started dictating arrest warrants for Lee and her assistant right there on the spot. Lee's lawyer tried to interrupt, saying his client had information about more prominent people involved if they could work out a deal. Gentry told him any cooperation would be considered, but she wasn't making promises until she knew what information Lee actually had. The lawyer kept pushing, but Gentry just kept writing up the warrants. Something hit me while watching all this happen. Tonight was supposed to be a major showcase according to that scheduling book. I mentioned it to the detective and asked if buyers might still show up not knowing about the raid. He immediately got on his radio and had unmarked cars positioned around the property to watch for anyone approaching. Not even 10 minutes later, an expensive black car pulled up to the curb. A man in a suit got out and started walking toward the door, but stopped when he saw all the police cars. He turned around fast and got back in his car. Officers followed him and ran his plates while he was trying to leave. The detective's radio crackled, and I heard them say the car was registered to a city official whose name I recognized from the news. More parents kept arriving after getting my earlier texts, and the driveway was getting packed. Each one wanted answers about what had been happening to their daughters. The detective had to assign an officer just to manage the crowd and keep people from contaminating the crime scene. English was still on his phone coordinating welfare checks on all the girls, while Reiner continued documenting injuries and taking statements from parents. The forensics team arrived with cases of equipment and went straight to that locked room with all the computers. They started making copies of everything before disconnecting the systems to prevent any remote wiping. One tech told the detective it would take days to go through all the video files, but from what he could see, there were recordings of every showcase for the past 5 years. Randy and Finch were keeping Lee and her assistant separated while the police processed them. The assistant kept crying and trying to talk, but her lawyer told her to stay quiet. Lee just sat there with this blank look like she couldn't believe she'd been caught. Every few minutes, another piece of evidence turned up and the case kept getting bigger. Reiner came out of the exam room after 2 hours with all 7 girls and walked straight to Gentry with her clipboard full of notes. She showed her the photos she'd taken of pressure marks on their legs and backs from holding positions for hours, the muscle strain patterns that matched forced posture training, and worst of all, signs of sleep deprivation in every single child. Gentry took one look at the medical documentation and started writing up additional charges for systematic physical abuse, while Reiner said she'd testify in court about the damage being done to these girls' developing bodies. The forensics team's van pulled up, and 3 techs in blue jackets carried in cases of equipment, heading straight for that locked computer room the detective had found earlier. They started pulling hard drives and making copies of everything before disconnecting the systems, and one tech mentioned to the detective that the files were all encrypted, but they could crack them back at the lab. Another tech was checking the showcase room's cameras and discovered they weren't just recording locally, but streaming to remote IP addresses, which meant buyers could watch from anywhere. English got off his phone and told me his team had reached all 12 families in the program, and 2 more girls were showing the same symptoms, so their parents were bringing them in for Reiner to examine right away. He was making notes in his tablet about each family's report, and I could see his face getting more angry with every story he documented. That's when I noticed Lee had somehow gotten her hands on a phone, even though she was supposed to be in custody, and she was whispering urgently to someone about cleaning everything up immediately. The detective saw it too and grabbed the phone from her, but she'd already ended the call, so he got on his radio asking for an emergency warrant to trace the number she'd dialed. Lee just sat there with this smug look like she'd already warned whoever needed warning, but the detective said they'd have the number traced within the hour. My phone buzzed with a text from Cullen saying his article was going live in 10 minutes, and true to his word, the story hit the news site with the headline about a foster trafficking ring being discovered. He'd kept all the children anonymous like he promised, but included enough details about the showcase room and the conditioning program that people would understand how serious this was. Within minutes, the article had hundreds of shares and comments from horrified readers demanding justice, and other news outlets started picking it up and calling the police station for statements. More cars started pulling into the driveway as foster parents who'd gotten my earlier texts arrived, wanting to know what was happening to their daughters. We ended up gathering in the parking lot while the police worked inside, and everyone was sharing stories about weird things their kids had been doing after Lee's sessions. One mom said her daughter would stand in the corner for hours practicing being still. Another found her 6-year-old had been skipping meals because dolls don't need food, and every story made us realize how blind we'd been to what was really happening. The locksmith finally arrived to work on that safe Randy had found, and it took him 40 minutes with special tools while a detective supervised and documented everything. When it finally clicked open, the detective put on gloves and started pulling out USB drives labeled with years, stacks of cash in different currencies including euros and yen, and then a leather folder that made him stop cold. Inside was a list of names with numbers next to them, and when he showed it to me, I saw Amelia's name at the top, with the highest price of all at $50,000. Lauren's car pulled up, and she got out holding Ellie's hand, the little girl who hadn't spoken above a whisper since her failed placement 2 months ago. Ellie saw the police cars and the officers leading Lee toward a patrol car in handcuffs, and something shifted in her face like she finally understood she wasn't the problem. She pulled away from her mom and walked right up to where Lee was being put in the car, and in the loudest voice any of us had heard from her in months, she said the words that made several parents start crying. The detective carefully inserted one of the USB drives from the safe into an evidence laptop, and his face went white as thumbnails loaded, showing photos of young girls from what looked like previous years. Some of the photos had red text stamped across them that said sold with dates underneath, and he immediately got on the phone calling the FBI, saying this was bigger than just our local area. He kept scrolling through the files with his gloves on, documenting everything while telling whoever was on the phone that they needed help tracking down at least 30 girls from the past 5 years. English was pacing back and forth on his phone with what sounded like his boss, and I heard him say they needed to review every private adoption facility in the state, immediately using emergency protocols. When he hung up, he came over to me and the other parents and admitted something that made my hands shake with anger. They'd gotten complaints about Lee's facility before, 3 different times over 2 years, but they'd never investigated properly because the complaints seemed vague and Lee always had perfect paperwork. 3 foster parents started talking to a lawyer who showed up after seeing Cullen's article online, and he pulled out business cards saying he'd take our cases for free if we wanted to sue everyone who failed our kids. Within an hour, 12 of us signed papers to start lawsuits against Lee's organization, the state agencies that ignored us, and the cops who wouldn't listen. The lawyer said we had enough evidence to make them all pay for what they let happen to our daughters. 2 black SUVs pulled up and FBI agents got out wearing those blue windbreakers you see on TV. The lead agent talked to English and the detective for a few minutes, then came over to us parents and said they'd been tracking similar operations in Oregon, Nevada, and Arizona for 6 months. He showed us photos on his tablet of other showcase rooms that looked just like Lee's with the same numbered platforms and viewing areas. They were taking over the trafficking parts of the case since it crossed state lines and involved organized crime networks. I held Amelia while a therapist the FBI brought started talking to her in the back of an ambulance they'd set up as a safe space. Amelia drew picture after picture on the paper they gave her, all showing girls standing on numbers with men watching from chairs. The therapist kept her voice soft and let Amelia draw without pushing her to talk. After 20 minutes, Amelia drew herself on platform 3 with an X over her mouth, and the therapist looked at me with tears in her eyes. She said it would take months or maybe years of therapy to help Amelia recover from this kind of conditioning. Lee's assistant started crying when the FBI agents told her she was looking at federal charges and offered her a deal if she'd tell them everything. She talked for 2 hours straight into their recorder about how Lee taught them to pick girls who were already damaged enough to break easier. She said they looked for foster kids with no family connections who wouldn't be missed if something went wrong. The assistant named 6 men who came to every showcase as regular buyers, including 2 judges from family court who helped Lee get access to more foster kids. She gave them passwords to encrypted files and showed them where Lee kept records of every girl who'd been sold over the years. Cullen's article got picked up by CNN and Fox News within 3 hours, and suddenly news vans started showing up at Lee's facility. They interviewed parents who wanted to talk and kept the cameras rolling as more evidence got carried out in boxes. A website got set up for donations to help pay for therapy for all the girls, and within a day it had raised over $100,000. People were angry and wanted to help however they could. Gentry showed up and told us a grand jury would review everything in the next few weeks to decide on official charges. She said this was the biggest child trafficking case the state had ever seen and promised she'd fight for the maximum sentence for everyone involved. She gave each parent her direct phone number and said to call if we remembered anything else or if our daughter said something important during therapy. Randy and Finch got taken to the police station for questioning about how they'd handled Lee and her assistant, but the chief let them go after an hour. He actually thanked them for preserving evidence properly and said their military training helped build a case that would hold up in court. Randy told me later the chief admitted they should have listened to me weeks ago when I first came in with concerns. The FBI agent came back over and told us they'd found records showing Lee had been running this operation for 7 years, with at least 40 girls going through her program. They were starting to track down every single one to check if they were safe and getting them help if they needed it. Some had been adopted by the buyers and disappeared completely, so it would take time to find them all. That night, Amelia actually slept for 6 hours straight, which was the longest she'd slept in weeks without waking up scared. She still checked that I was there every couple hours, reaching out to touch my arm, then going back to sleep. Her therapist said this was normal and would get better as she felt safer. She warned me Amelia might have nightmares and flashbacks for a long time. 2 weeks later, the indictments came down, and Lee got charged with federal trafficking, conspiracy, and 37 counts of child abuse. Her assistant got 15 years in a plea deal for testifying against everyone else. They arrested 4 of the buyers at their homes, and 2 more tried to run but got caught at the airport. The judges who bought girls both got 40-year sentences after the evidence showed they'd been part of planning the whole operation from the start. English showed up at my door 3 weeks later with a thick folder and an apology that looked like it physically hurt him to give. He stood there in his suit explaining how his department was putting in new rules for checking adoption places with surprise visits and better training for workers. I watched him shift his weight from foot to foot as he went through his prepared speech about how they'd failed us and were making sure it wouldn't happen again. He had to visit all 12 families to say the same thing, and I could see he'd already been to a few by how tired his eyes looked. The FBI agent called that same afternoon to tell me they'd caught one of the buyers trying to board a plane to Costa Rica with a fake passport. Another one got grabbed at the Canadian border when the dogs found cash hidden in his car panels. The businessman who'd been on Lee's special list tried to run, but they got him right on the golf course at his country club while he was playing with 3 senators. The news crews filmed him being walked to the police car in his golf shoes, and that clip played on every channel for days. We started taking the girls to group therapy at the Children's Hospital, where they had a specialist who knew about this kind of trauma. Amelia sat in a circle with Isabella and Julia and Grace and the other girls every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon. At first, they just colored pictures and didn't talk much, but after a few sessions, Isabella started telling the therapist about the showcase room. Then Julia said she remembered being told not to cry because dolls don't have tears. Grace talked about practicing her poses in the mirror at night when she couldn't sleep. Watching them slowly start to act like regular kids again made my chest tight every single time. Lee's lawyer tried a new angle at her hearing by saying she wasn't mentally stable and needed treatment instead of prison. The court ordered 3 different doctors to check her out, and they all said the same thing after their evaluations. She knew exactly what she was doing and planned everything carefully for years. Her lawyer switched tactics after that and started offering information about other people involved if they'd reduce her sentence. Gentry called me 2 months later to say we needed to testify at the state capitol about what happened. 6 of us parents sat in front of a committee of lawmakers and told them everything while they took notes and asked questions. I explained how CPS were ignored us, and the police laughed at our concerns, and nobody listened until it was almost too late. Lauren cried when she described finding Ellie in the closet, and the committee members looked sick when we showed them the photos of the bruises. They started writing new laws right there in the meeting requiring background checks for anyone working at adoption facilities and surprise inspections every month. The FBI kept digging into Lee's computer files and found she was connected to groups in 6 other states plus operations in Mexico and Romania. They arrested 43 more people over the next 4 months, including doctors who provided fake medical clearances and lawyers who handled the paperwork. What we thought was just happening in our town turned out to be part of something huge that had been going on for almost a decade. They found records of over 200 kids who'd gone through similar programs, and agents started tracking down every single one. Amelia started kindergarten in September, with a special plan in place for her needs. Her teacher knew about everything and had extra training for helping kids with trauma. The first few weeks were hard, and she'd hide under her desk sometimes when things got too loud. But by October, she was finger painting with the other kids, and even made a friend named Sophie who liked dinosaurs as much as she did. She still had bad days where she'd go quiet and stare at nothing, but they happened less and less. The therapy was working, and she started laughing at cartoons again, and asking for bedtime stories about brave princesses who saved themselves. Lee's trial took 6 months, but when it finally ended, the judge gave her life in federal prison without any chance of parole. They read statements from 7 of the girls at sentencing, including one from Ellie, who stood up in court and said Lee stole her voice, but she found it again. The judge had to take a break after that because even he was crying. Lee just sat there staring straight ahead like she was the one who'd gone empty. Her assistant took a deal and got 15 years with possible parole after 10 if she behaved in prison. The buyers all got different sentences based on what they'd done, with the longest being 40 years, for the 2 judges who'd helped set everything up. One businessman who'd bought 3 girls over the years got 35 years and died of a heart attack in his cell before the first year was up. The others got between 20 and 30 years each, and none of them would ever work with kids again. English got picked to help run a new federal task force that would look for operations like Lee's all over the country. He called me to say they were using our case as the example of how to gather evidence the right way and protect the kids during investigations. He'd gone from the guy who dismissed us to someone who spent every day making sure this couldn't happen to other children. The task force found 4 more trafficking rings in their first year, using the methods Randy and Finch had shown them for preserving evidence. It felt strange knowing our worst nightmare had turned into something that saved hundreds of other kids from the same fate. The support group started meeting every Thursday at the community center, and within 2 months we had 30 families showing up regularly. Lauren took charge of organizing everything while I handled the legal paperwork to make us an official nonprofit. And we got our 501c3 status approved faster than expected, because the judge who reviewed our application was the same one from Amelia's case. We set up a hotline that rang to 3 different phones so someone could always answer. When a parent called scared about something they noticed, and in the first 6 months we helped 12 families get their kids out of bad situations before anything terrible happened. The local news did a piece on us which brought in donations and volunteers, and soon we had enough money to rent a small office space where parents could come for resources and advice. Cullen's articles kept getting picked up by bigger outlets, and when the Pulitzer Committee announced he'd won for his series on our case, he called me crying because he never thought writing about something so dark would lead to recognition. He showed up at our next support group meeting with a check for half the prize money made out to our organization and said the kids deserved it more than he did. The ceremony was fancy with everyone in suits and dresses, but Cullen wore a pin with a butterfly on it that Amelia had drawn for him and mentioned every single girl by their fake names in his acceptance speech. A year after that first terrible night at Lee's place, the adoption papers finally went through, and I stood in the courthouse holding Amelia's hand while the judge made it official. She'd been calling me by my first name for months, but right after the judge signed the papers, She looked up at me and said, "Mom," for the first time, and I lost it right there in the courtroom. The judge was one of the good ones who'd helped prosecute the Byers, and he gave Amelia a stuffed animal and told her she was the bravest kid he'd ever met. Isabella got adopted by her foster family the next month, and Julia's aunt flew in from Oregon to take her home after passing all the background checks and home visits. Grace went back to her biological mom, who'd gotten clean and stable while her daughter was in foster care, and seeing them reunite at the CPS office made everyone, including English, cry. Every single girl from Lee's program found a safe, permanent home within 18 months, and we kept track through our support group to make sure they stayed safe. Reiner quit her hospital job to open a clinic specifically for kids who'd been through trafficking or severe abuse, and she got grants from 3 different foundations plus ongoing donations from some of the wealthy people who felt guilty about not noticing what was happening in their community. The clinic had therapists and doctors and social workers all in one building, so kids didn't have to tell their story over and over to different people, and Reiner made sure every family could afford treatment even if they had no insurance. She testified in 14 different trials over 2 years, and her medical documentation helped convict every single person who'd hurt those girls. The building where Lee ran her program sat empty for months with broken windows and graffiti until the city finally approved demolition, and a local contractor did the work for free after hearing what happened there. A landscape company donated their time to turn the lot into a memorial garden with a playground and benches and flower beds that bloom in different colors through the seasons. Amelia and I go there every April to plant new flowers, and she always picks yellow ones because she says they look happy, and that place needs happy things now. English got called to Washington to receive a federal commendation for his reform work, and they filmed him explaining the new protocols to a room full of CPS directors from every state. He sent copies of the training materials to our support group and visited every few months to check on the families and make sure the new safety measures were working. His department became the model for the whole country, with other states sending their workers here for training on recognizing trafficking signs and protecting vulnerable kids. Randy and Finch used their military contacts to set up a nonprofit that trained foster parents and social workers in evidence preservation and threat assessment. They ran weekend workshops teaching people how to document abuse properly and when to push past bureaucratic resistance, and their manual became required reading for new foster parents in 6 states. The precision they showed that night at Lee's place became the standard for how to handle these situations, and they consulted on dozens of cases where kids needed immediate extraction from dangerous situations. 3 years went by, and Amelia started 2nd grade in a regular classroom with kids who had no idea what she'd been through. She joined the soccer team and scored 2 goals in her first game and made friends with a girl named Katie who loved dinosaurs as much as she did. The nightmares still happened maybe once a month instead of every night, and her therapist said she was processing everything better than most adults would. She still went to therapy every other week, but spent most sessions drawing pictures or playing games while talking about regular kid stuff instead of the dark things from before. A letter came from the federal prosecutor saying the last buyer had been convicted on all charges and would spend the rest of his life in prison. The investigation that started in our town had spread to 14 countries and saved over 200 kids from situations like Amelia's or worse, and the prosecutor said none of it would have happened if we hadn't pushed open that door. The governor's office called 6 months later, asking if I'd serve on the new Foster Care Reform Commission. I drove to the state capitol for the first meeting, where 20 other people sat around a huge table with folders and laptops. We spent 8 hours going through every rule and procedure that failed kids like Amelia. I showed them photos from Lee's showcase room and watched their faces change. The commission met every month, and we rewrote the entire foster care handbook from scratch. We made surprise inspections mandatory and created a hotline where kids could call without going through their caseworkers first. Every private adoption facility had to install cameras in common areas and submit footage monthly. We required background checks going back 20 years for anyone working with foster kids. The work was slow and boring sometimes, but every new rule we passed meant another kid might stay safe. 2 years into the commission work, Amelia's teacher called about an art contest. She'd painted butterflies breaking out of cardboard boxes using every color she could find. The butterflies had huge wings and tiny smiles, and one was helping another escape. At the school assembly, they called her name for first place, and she ran up to get her blue ribbon. She held it up and grinned so big I started crying right there in the auditorium. Her painting got displayed in the school lobby where everyone could see it. That night, she taped the ribbon to her bedroom mirror and told me the butterflies were like the girls from Lee's place finally getting to fly away. That's a wrap for now. Thanks for just hanging out and exploring all these little details with me. Until next time, subscribe for more content like this.